for the past are jeopardising peace. We saw over time this gave way to a slightly broader discussion of whether there should be criminal justice or truth. And that in turn gave way to a broader, more holistic acceptance that transitional justice could do many, many different things. And that's it we're sort of in an era at the moment beyond truth versus justice, where different ideas, different concerns become important, most notably economic justice. And that's what we are going to look at today. So there's quite a few readings that were there, all of which I hope you found relatively useful, and we'll talk our way through it. There's a couple of people here who are strongly of the opinion that economic justice is very important. We have a couple of writers who are again committed to economic justice but have their reservations about the wisdom of transitional justice as a tool to address it. And we have some foundational reading from Brown et al. Discussing the whole notion of horizontal accountability. So we'll go and have a look at that in the course of today's class. But I'll just start off one more time with names. So, hello there. Hello. Hello there. Hello. What's your name? Again, sorry.
Sue. And this is Mohammed Naeem, Naywm.
Sim. Maria.
Ryan.
And Ruth. Yes. Vibha.
David.
Kaya.
Okay. And I've had a few apologies from people who can't be here on account of trains and illness and things like that. Okay, let's start off with the first question. Again, one thing that became clear when I was sitting in last week here in Alex's class, some people are very interested in notions of economic justice. So hopefully if you've got any questions and things, we can address them today. But let's start off with this fundamental question. What is horizontal inequality? What do we mean by it? One of the arguments that the formative question is addressing is notions of poverty and economic injustice being at the root of all conflict and authoritarianism. One way of looking at this is horizontal inequality. So, what do we mean by it? Ruth?
So it's inequalities between culturally defined groups, and it's the idea that it's more inequalities on like an economic or a social scale. So people who, so it's got like socio-economic dimensions, so inequalities in what you own, and then political inequalities, and then cultural status inequalities.
Okay, very good. So we're talking about what do you mean by like horizontal though? Like you're talking, what do you mean by like different sort of economic groups? Who are you talking about? Can you think of any examples?
So it's like if you look at Northern Ireland, it'd be like the Protestants and the Catholics. It's that they're not. I don't know how to put it across. Their inequalities don't necessarily come through obvious means. It's more to do with the way they're living their life. So Protestants obviously believe in something, believe in a different religion to Catholics. So it's about the inequalities that stem through that, the effects that then has on different, like their economic income.
Okay, no, well, again, one of the reasons, I mean, you're getting there, but again, one of the reasons we ask these questions is to see what exactly can be articulated and what can't. But you're right. Northern Ireland is a good example of a place where horizontal inequalities were at play. The nature of the state in Northern Ireland for a long time was that it was a Protestant-dominated state, so the best employment opportunities and things would go to Protestants, and they had much greater income than Catholics for a number of years. So you had certainly an identifiable religious divide between Catholic and Protestants, but that translated economically as well into different economic opportunities for Protestants and for Catholics, which are slowly being redressed nowadays, but historically that was certainly the case. Any other examples? Jess?
Well, Brown said that the horizontal inequality is inequality among groups, and that the concept of horizontal inequality thus differs from normal definitions of inequality, which is what he terms vertical inequality, because the latter lines individuals or households up vertically and measures inequality over a range of individuals rather than groups. So like horizontal inequality seems to be more, it's not necessarily based on an individual, it's based on a wide range of individuals who form a collective group or have a collective thing between that connects them all together.
Okay, so again, an example of, and I'll take it a second, an example of possibly vertical inequality in Britain would be the banker and the guy getting food stamps in Britain at the moment. I mean, that's an example of vertical inequality in a way. You have a group of people who are clearly doing well within an economy, people who are doing poorly within it, but we tend to individualise that. We rarely think of people collectively as the poor and the rich as such, or we do, but they're not identifiable groups in the same way that we'd say Catholics and Protestants are in Northern Ireland. David?
Let's see, that's what I was going to say. I was just going to say that I kind of, when I was reading, I interpreted the verticals being more sort of classism, whereas the horizontal was more along religious lines.
Sorry, that's what yes, sorry, we talk about it, typically we've always looked at inequality, in class-based terms, you're right. Capitalist class, for example, working class or lumpen proletariat. That's typically how we've always identified it. That's been the classical understanding of it. But what people began to understand with horizontal inequality is that it can sometimes manifest itself slightly differently. You can have these large-scale divisions between ethnic or religious groups, which means that you could have, say, whites and blacks in South Africa, for example. You would have very rich whites and you'd have some very poor whites. Nevertheless, they would be, we consider that more of a form of horizontal inequality than vertical one, because inequality seemed to be mediated more by race than by class. Even though you could clearly point to a small number of rich black people, you could point to a lot of very poor white people. We tend to identify inequality in that country on a horizontal basis. Any other examples of conflicts where inequalities in terms of where these horizontal inequalities have clearly been a motor of conflict or war or authoritarianism? Cal?
I was thinking of Yugoslavia.
Go on.
Well, there's ethnic disparity between the different groups. Muslims were seen as middle class. Well, Muslims consider themselves as a middle class to the ethnic groups.
Yeah, well there was this notion. Again, Yugoslavia might be one of those examples of ones where there's certainly as much an ethnic or an ideological impetus as there is an economic one. The whole notion of the war in Yugoslavia started out as the attempt by Serbia and Croatia to carve out bits of Bosnia that they could retain as a sort of an ethnic homeland. But there is arguably an economic dimension to it as well. This land was worth money. It served as a form of excluding Bosnian Muslims in particular from local economies. We see that with ethnic cleansing. There was an attempt, I suppose, to take over properties and things like that. So again, that's one of those cases that we can clearly see an economic dimension to it. Any others? Right?
Arguably, global north and global south when it comes to international law, and that global north and global south as two distinct groups are sort of portraying horizontal inequalities, for example, economically as perpetuated by some, let's say, international law. So,
I wouldn't disagree with you at all. We are more talking about specific states, though. Like I accept your point absolutely. I mean, the whole division of international law, the way it is, it clearly allows for the benefit of prosperous states, those that have historically benefited from the structure of international law. But I'm thinking more in terms of individual states at the moment.
Daarvoor, in the wider
Go on.
dat is really an ethnic sort of aspect of the conflict, ethnic mobilization, state sanction.
Okay, but how does that tie into the notion of horizontal inequalities?
There's horizontal inequality between the black Christians in the south and the black population in Darfur, as opposed to the Arab populations in.
Okay, but that's still, we're still talking there about ethnic difference, but how does that tie into economics?
Does it have to? It can be horizontal inequalities politically and culturally as well.
Well, that is true, I suppose. Sometimes there is imbalances in terms of particularly in terms of political power. In Sudan, the government is effectively run for the benefit of the Arab government in Khartoum, and the predominantly black Christian South had very little economic power, which is very true. But one of the motors of the conflict in Darfur were the fact that most oil was found in the south, yet most of the profits for the oil were going north. And one of the arguments I think that has been made in relation to horizontal inequalities here is that often you need an economic motor for conflict, that merely different race or different ethnicity in and of itself may not suffice to ground warfare or the types of repressive social conditions that you need for authoritarianism. Sometimes there needs to be an economic imperative behind it as well. Again, South Africa is a very good example. It wasn't just a case of whites having a racial antipathy towards blacks. There was also an element of being able to retain control of industry and natural resources and to exploit cheap labour as well. So again, racial ethnic divisions often will map onto patterns of economics as well. What types of approaches are typically adopted to address horizontal inequalities? Maria?
There are three types of approaches that can be taken to face horizontal inequalities. The first one is direct approaches, and it is related to involve the targeting group directly, but there's a risk that could be the increasing of the salience or identity difference. So you can make them like more proud of their origin, and therefore could bring you some problems with the other groups. The second approach is indirect approach, which is, on the other hand, consists on universalistic policies, and the design of which means that they are likely to reduce horizontal inequalities. But the third approach, which is the integrationist approach, would look for what, not to tackle horizontal inequalities, but seeks to reduce the salience of group boundaries and promote national identities, and also encouraging shared economic or political activities. I would say, from my point of view, that the third one would be the more useful, because it would cover to reduce the salience between different groups and bring them into a national identity, and it would create also economic and political activities for them all together as a community and not in separate groups. So you could actually focus in different groups but bring them together and make them feel like part of one country, one community.
Okay, that certainly sounds like the most idealistic approach. Is that realistic after a period of war, or after a period of repression, where one group in society clearly identifies another group as being oppressors and often, of course, they will already have commandeered most of the economic resources in a society. I mean, integrationist approaches are something that we will go and look at, and we look how transitional justice can influence them. But we need to bear in mind that it is quite complicated sometimes after periods of conflict.
So would you say that indirect approaches would be more useful in this case to reduce horizontal inequality?
Well, it depends very much on the sort of the state in question. I mean, we talk about directly addressing inequalities. People talk about things like positive discrimination, for example, or some form of economic power sharing, where you guarantee ethnic groups control over their own resources and things like that. All of which, of course, can be very, very positive measures and very useful, but they tend to reify or increase the salience of ethnicity. There's very much two different groups in society, and we're definitely helping one of them, but there's no real impetus for the communities to really come together as such. It's more a defensive thing. There's other elements like indirect ways of doing that as well, but nevertheless they tend to perhaps reinforce identity as well. And that's one of the things that maybe transitional justice has to address. Can things like truth commissions or trials really do much to mitigate these sorts of differences? Can they address forms of economic inequality? Vilba, you were going to say something, were you?
Yeah, while I agree with Maria that an integrationist approach seems very ideal and the way forward, but realistically I think that it needs to be a mixture of both direct and indirect, though not integrationist to start with, but the fact that, for example, giving reservations or having quotas for employment or recognizing the language, these are direct forms of removing horizontal inequalities. And I feel that indirect comes in the next stage, where it looks to protect the removal of these horizontal inequalities through like positive discrimination, and it seeks to protect that. So I think it comes in like different stages of transition in a state, where the direct, reducing direct horizontal inequality comes first, after which, as a takeaway to maintain that standpoint, an indirect reducing mechanism is used.
Yeah, that seems to be the way most states respond to economic inequality when, and this also doesn't always happen, they make a concerted effort to do so. They address the most serious forms of inequality directly while they can. Over time, the hope is to create a more inclusive state, and again, they may engage in more indirect forms as well of addressing economic inequality. Often the sort of the third way integrationist forms of justice may be very, very far away indeed. We don't have that many examples of countries, post-conflict countries, getting that far. What we often see instead is just a government that commits to no longer abusing other communities economically or politically or culturally. You may not get to that stage of integration, but as you say, if you are to go and do them, it will generally be quite a long-term process. And again, we're not really looking for silver bullet solutions, but one of the things we'll do hopefully in the course of this seminar is discuss ways in which transitional justice can inform the processes by which governments begin to deal with economic inequality. And again, there's no suggestion that transitional justice can do it all by itself. Louise Arbour argues that the focus of transitional justice on large-scale past abuses, the dominant understanding of which is limited to civil and political rights violations, obscures the need to address horizontal inequalities and gross violations of economic, social and cultural rights. So there's an argument here, Arbour is making it, that sometimes our focus on civil and political rights can obscure or block out forms of economic justice. Do you agree with this, Sue? Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that to some extent it's true because, for example, the trials that are set up, we only focus on prosecuting the perpetrators rather than focusing on the economic, social and cultural rights. And then I read that some governments think that focusing on economic, social and cultural rights is like a long-term goal, so they would rather just focus on prosecuting the perpetrators first before they move on to the other part.
Okay.
To some extent, true.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's two sort of points you were making there. The first is that civil and political rights, particularly crimes, they tend to occupy an awful lot of the attention early on. And it may just be a problem of imagination. The notion of trials, genocide, crimes against humanity occupy such a large space of our imagination that there is a natural tendency to go and look at these things to begin with. And then, of course, there's this possibility that because we feel the need to deal with them so immediately, everything else is sort of is pushed back, deferred, or delayed to a later point. What do you think of that argument, Aidan? Do you think that an emphasis on civil and political rights will serve to obscure, detract attention from socioeconomic issues?
I think it can do, but at the same time, I don't think people who are arguing specifically for transitional justice to be based on civil and political rights should be ignorant or sort of ignoring the reasons behind why such atrocities take place. But yeah, I'd agree at the same time that it does essentially take away from the causes of sort of the crimes that are being committed. And
okay, fair enough. But I mean, is it sort of a zero-sum game? Is there sort of that hydraulic effect between focusing on one thing automatically meaning you lose focus on another? I mean, some people argue they're different things, that the economics are just completely different to sort of physical, bodily integrity abuses of the sort that people used to focus on all the time. There's the job of departments of economics or the economy to address, and not necessarily the role of the judiciary or truth commissions or reparations. I mean, are we talking about two completely different things?
no, I think they're definitely interlinked. economics and sort of social aspects of like poverty and power. And, I mean, it is all interlinked, but surely it's got to be about priorities and what you think you can achieve, and like sort of what you can achieve best by taking certain measures. But I think surely it's got to be much easier to focus on political and civil rights than it is to focus on economic.
Absolutely. Well, we'll go back to that question. It almost certainly is easier to go and do so. But I suppose one of the things we're going to have to look at in the course of the seminar today is whether our concentration on trials and truth commissions, the sort of things, for example, you were looking at last week when you talked about the Sierra Leone Truth Commission and other bodies like that, does that serve to relegate economic injustice as a priority, or is it something that's completely unrelated to it? And again, as you say, the whole notion of feasibility is something that we need to think about as well, because we may want to prioritise socio-economic justice, but we may also realise that we have fewer levers to pull to make it happen. That's something we will look at. Jess?
I was going to say that I think the main reason that we focus primarily on the criminal aspect of things rather than the social and economic issues is because it's a lot easier to publicly deal with those things, and it's a lot, I mean, trials and that aren't quicker, but it is quicker to deal with that than it is to deal with necessarily like systemic racism or systemic economic issues within the country that you're having to go to. You know, like for example in South Africa, there's still huge systemic racism built into the country 20 years on from the end of apartheid, and it hasn't ended, it hasn't stopped, and that's why you're seeing a resurgence of violence, especially within the universities and towards the current government. But it's a lot easier to address like the criminal aspect of things and to try and gain a sense of truth than it is to sort of go, well, we're going to now reform the political, economic, social aspects of the entire country.
Yeah. Okay, so you're arguing that addressing civil and political abuses is very necessary, but it's in a way a smaller, more feasible task than fundamentally dealing with massive social structure. Yeah. Okay.
I don't agree with that.
You don't agree?
Yeah,
okay.
I agree with that.
Oh, you agree? Sorry.
Yeah.
Go on.
Because, as just said, criminal kind of approach is much easier with courts. We can sue someone and we can try someone, put someone in front of a trial. But when it comes to economics, especially social and cultural rights, to change the society, to kind of make the process of transition possible in society and the mentality of the society, it's something that takes years, decades, and maybe sometimes it comes hand in hand, but the changes are not as quickly visible as in the case of the criminal process. So the economic and social cultural rights, they take ages to kind of see the effect of the change actually. That's why maybe they come hand in hand, but they're just less visible straight away.
Okay, so I think the point you're making, that with criminal trials, you pull in 15 or 20 suspects, you have a number of judges, a number of prosecutors, a number of defendants, but these processes tend to be limited to 3 or 4 years. There's a definable range of tasks that don't bring in an enormous number of people, and the outputs like deterrence or expressivism can be immediately related to a trial. And you're right, there's an argument that to change fundamental matters of culture or economy involve thousands of people, or tens of thousands of people, or hundreds of thousands of people. So arguably it's a more complicated task, which doesn't necessarily mean it shouldn't be done, of course, but perhaps some analogies that are drawn between the two might be a little bit simple. Go on, Vivian.
While I agree with Jess and Kyle on what they're saying, I believe that the fact that civil and political rights violations occur are based on the existing economic, social and cultural fabric in a society. So the fact that there already is a violation on certain accounts will also mean that it amounts to cultural and civil and political rights violations. So it's not that it's not being addressed or it's being left out, but the fact that looking at civil and political rights, which seem to be codified a lot more, substantially than economic, social, and political, social and cultural rights, acts as a starting point on where your transition begins into a new phase or a new government. So while you address civil and political rights and say these are the violations, you're also acknowledging the fact that these rights have been violated because there has been some kind of an imbalance in your economic, social, and cultural fabric.
Okay, and I take your point, but if you are a person, let's say you're a man in Guatemala, okay, and your village has been burnt down, your wife has been killed, your children were kidnapped, all your crops are gone, you have no employment. I mean, is it really going to be meaningful to you if a general is put on trial in the capital city miles away for some example from episodes of torture or war crimes that he was complicit in?
So my point here being the fact that one person's being held liable, and the reason for any of this happening, my wife being killed, my children being kidnapped, and all of that, is a result of conflict. So in a way, you're attributing the responsibility of the conflict onto someone, and that acts as a starting point of transition into a better society, acknowledging the fact that there is someone responsible. It doesn't mean it takes away from the fact that there are economic and cultural problems that exist, but you're able to attribute that to someone, and that acts as a starting point. And once you've accepted that there is a conflict to blame for that, it becomes easier for a society to transition further along.
Okay, the argument you make is a perfectly reasonable one, and it's one that people have argued down peers that one of the absolute first step towards addressing all forms of injustice is to deal with things like torture and the most extreme violations against people. But one thing that becomes clear, and I don't know if it's in any of the readings, I couldn't put everything I wanted into the readings, but every year people go to countries like Nepal, Sri Lanka, the former Yugoslavia, and do surveys of the population about their perceptions of justice and what they think is really important. And almost every poll we see suggests that people are far more concerned about issues like education and food and employment than they are about the grand narratives that are created by truth commissions or about the criminal accountability that trials can go and secure. I'm going to let Jess in, I know, and then I'll go back to you, Viva. Go on.
I was actually going to disagree with Viva. I don't think that, well, I agree in the short term. I think it might, help some people deal, to accept that, people there is a trial, there is some sort of form of justice or whatever. But I don't think that adequately allows for transition to actually occur, because by not addressing the political, the social, the economic issues, what's then going to happen is you're just going to get a resurgence of violence 10, 20 years down the line. And, for example, in South Africa, the main reason there was a resurgence of violence, at least in the universities, is because of the raising tuition fees, and because it priced so many people out going into university. And I think that the average person doesn't care about, a war criminal being tried. It's usually done so out of their villages or out of their cities or whatever, that it just doesn't affect them if they don't see it. But the fact is, if they don't have food to feed their families, or they don't have medication to help the sick, or they don't have a roof over their heads, or they don't have anything, that's what's going to affect them more. I don't think people generally care about the political elite. People, will still get along with their day, even if they are living under a dictatorship. You just learn to cope. But at the end of it, what's more important is, do I have food to feed my kids? Can I get them to a hospital? Can we live? Full stop. And if you can't, then there's going to be more violence. There's never going to be a successful and peaceful transition that is long lasting and affects the entirety of the community.
Good point. David, Brian.
Yeah, it's fine to disagree with me.
I like it. Disagreement is good. Yeah.
So I don't particularly agree with Jess. Sorry, Jess. So when you say conflict repeats and stuff like that, you need to understand that there's an evolution of conflict, the nature of conflict, it's different things. People in society with globalization, with things moving forward, it's different things that people are revolting for. And transition isn't something that happens overnight. And transition is going to happen and continue to happen over decades in a country. It's not something that a change is going to happen. But how do you start? Like, where is the starting point? You can't look at addressing everything as a starting point. When you look at truth commissions, when you look at providing reparations, when you look at trials, it also involves the international community to a certain degree. And the international community, like while respecting the sovereignty of a nation, can't go into these aspects of a country's transition. So while they're looking at addressing and making sure that they uphold the rights, human rights of people that are present by starting off with attributing the cause of this violence in a particular city or dictatorship or authoritarianism to one person or a group of people, that's society's way of kind of saying this is what we're done with and moving forward. And that acts as a starting point, because what comes in next, the government, the transitioning government which comes in next, it becomes their duty to either directly or indirectly address horizontal inequalities.
Okay, we see sort of two very well made arguments here that tend in different directions. Jess, on the one hand, is right ahead thinking that many people on a day-to-day basis may not care that very much about huge political change at the level of accountability for generals or the narratives of history that are created by truth commissions. But the point that it makes is a very good one, that in transition, governments would typically address civil and political rights because there is this argument that you can accept or reject that it is useful for stabilising society, that if you have some measure of criminal accountability, you have some measure of truth, it helps the stability or peacefulness of the society. And the sheer fact that society is no longer at war has an enormous bearing on people's socio-economic lives. That's something that is worth bearing in mind. Most people are always better off under conditions of peace and stability, even if society isn't fundamentally changing, than they are when they are at war. David,
And very similar, I was just going to say, I think this sort of transitional justice has its role to play in identifying truth, liability, responsibility about specific economic crime, so in individualising it and saying certain individuals in the old regime created this economic policy and bring the truth about it. But I don't think it's the responsibility of truth commissions in terms of development or redistribution of wealth. I really feel that there's the onus is always on the government really to do that, and that there shouldn't be an attempt to try and shift responsibility for these issues away from the government too.
Okay, that's interesting. We will come back to that. That I think ties in more with some of the questions we're going to look at later. The question of whether things like truth commissions can diagnose socioeconomic problems in the first place, and if they do, is that a way for a government to simply shift responsibility to them? That's something I want to come back to later. Brian?
So I would go a different route and say that there's no sort of one or the other, and that the categorization that we're talking about of civil and political rights and of socio-economic rights are incredibly problematic. And if somebody says on the one hand that all people sort of talk about or need is food or housing as socio-economic rights, is incredibly problematic as well, like you've mentioned. And this also stems from after Ava had noticed that transitional justice focuses on civil and political rights rather than the other category. She said that this also has historical context to it, which was that the categories were developed sort of around the Cold War, post the Cold War era. And then we have the civil, political, and economic, social rights separated in covenants. But then she also said that is incredibly problematic, because there is an intricate link between human rights, security, and development, and that transitional justice needs to acknowledge that if it hopes to even make any form of difference in access to any form of rights, and that it is really problematic to say that we are going to focus on civil and political rights, and in the hopes that will lead to economic and social rights, when the two categories are so intricately linked. An example is that if you, for example, under a discriminatory regime, sort of limit the freedom of movement of a certain group of people, then that is also going to be linked to them accessing economic opportunities because they cannot move. So that it is just not viable to say that let us focus on one group and then of rights, and then hopefully that will lead to another group of rights. And that if transitional justice has any aim of addressing horizontal inequalities, then it needs to address the two as intricately linked and not as self-standing group of rights.
Absolutely. The problem may be even worse though than you're suggesting in a way, because transitional justice doesn't really focus on civil and political rights as a whole. It focuses on even a very narrow subset of them. Crimes of atrocity, torture, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Transitional justice, the argument goes that transitional justice isn't even really focusing on civil and political rights as a broad concept that can interact with socio-economic rights. It's focusing on quite a narrow subset of civil and political rights, which you're absolutely right here. I mean, the argument is never that you consider socio-economic rights instead of civil and political ones. Is that you consider them together as sort of mutually reinforcing. Nevertheless, there is a suggestion in a lot of the writing that socio-economic rights are more imperative or more important to address in transition. So I suppose that brings us to the fourth question that's here. Arbour argues that transitional justice must have the ambition to assist the transformation of oppressed societies into free one by addressing the injustices of the past through measures that will procure an equitable future. It must reach to, but also beyond, the crimes and abuses committed during the conflict that led to the transition. It must address human rights violations that predated the conflict and caused or contributed. Do you agree that transitional justice should expand to deal with these issues? Liam?
You can say that it should in a way, because when you look at trials and truth commissions, you can say that they raise awareness, and awareness can be seen as one of the main forms of education. So there is some kind of social, economic kind of principle behind that, because if you're going to educate the future population about past atrocities, it could have a very good benefit for the culture that's coming in, because educating the culture is probably one of the most important ways to deal with what's happening.
Okay, so you're optimistic that trials and truth commissions, because they're very public, they can inform societies about the nature of economic abuses that they may not necessarily be aware of, or if they're aware of them, they can...
It's a starting point at least.
Starting point at least. Kaya?
For me, my opinion is that without considering the past and thinking about the future, for me, transition is not possible.
Go on.
Because because it has this education aspect about the past, that we're not going to make the same mistakes. And thinking about the future, when the transition process is taking part, we have to think about future society. We have to consider what we could do better in the future, considering the past. And for me, this is what transition means. Despite the criminal, politics, or economic, or culture, it doesn't matter. This is for me, it's the new source of transition. If you have to consider past and the future, for me, it's not possible without these.
But what do you mean by consider? We've looked at some mechanisms so far. We've looked at trials and truth commissions. We're going to look at reparations next week. What do you mean by considering socio-economic justice? When you say transitional justice should consider these things, what do you mean? Who are you talking about? What mechanisms?
Let's say an example that it happened many times, for example, in Poland, that during the transition process, not all the problems were approached, and now, because it wasn't approached at that point, now the truth commissions are taking part, and people are trying to drag past, stuff from the past that just not irrelevant anymore. It was relevant at the point of the transition, but because people at that point never thought about the future of the country, that's why it's just still I'm not against truth commissions, but there are just stuff happening right now that people are dragging people from the past, and what these people did, totally unnecessary.
Okay.
Is what I mean.
Okay, but I suppose one of the things that I find frustrating about a lot of the stuff that we're reading here is that people constantly make this argument that transitional justice must do things. It must address socio-economic issues, or it must address poverty, but people don't really give any specifics about what it is that they are going and talking about. So that's one of the things you might consider today or in the formative assessment. When we say transitional justice should address issues of poverty or economic injustice. What exactly do we mean by it? De Grief is less ambitious than Arbour or Miller in terms of what transitional justice can achieve in addressing poverty. He argues that transitional justice can foster the basic conditions in which development can occur by fostering a more participatory and inclusive environment on the one hand and good governance on the other. So he thinks basically that if you focus on civil and political rights, it can build civic trust on the one hand, and that it can establish rights as something that people can claim. So, Aidan, what do you make of this argument that the focus on civil and political rights is narrow, but it's something that transitional justice is typically good at, but it can create conditions of trust between citizens because the law is stronger, and it can establish the whole language of rights as something that can be claimed. And that could extend towards economic rights, arguably. Are you convinced by it?
I'm much more convinced that it's a more feasible sort of way of approaching the problems, sort of fostering the civil and political rights in a society that could eventually lead to the growth of economic and social and cultural rights is a much more feasible way of achieving that long term, I think, as opposed to simply just enforcing certain things on certain societies.
What do you mean by enforcing certain things in certain
I'd much sooner allow people sort of much more transparency in government and much more freedom to govern themselves and decide on their own economic and social futures, as opposed to enforcing certain economic policies or sort of cultural policies upon people.
But what if those economic policies are good ones? I mean, one of the arguments is that if you look at the example of the Sierra Leone Trade Commission, for example, it diagnosed the role of the diamond trade in the wars in Sierra Leone. It showed how damaging they could be to society. One of the recommendations it made, for example, is that the diamond trade be more regulated by government, and that the revenues from diamond trade would be used to fund public health and social welfare and things like that. Is that not, good? Is there not a role for transitional justice bodies in making those sorts of recommendations?
Perhaps, but I mean, if these sorts of transparency and democratic rights were fostered in Sierra Leone, I don't think that people could come to that conclusion themselves.
Okay, so there is an argument, and it's one that De Grief is making as well. It's De Grief and Waldorf make this sort of point that these big decisions about economics are fundamentally democratic decisions, that they should be made by governments and by the people. Transitional justice institutions aren't necessarily equipped to go and make them. So maybe it might be better, this possibly relates to what Bill was saying earlier as well, that it may be better to concentrate on what transitional justice is good at, to establish democratic norms, to establish the language of rights, to establish civil decency, than it is to be overly ambitious and say that we're going to fundamentally re-alter society or change its roots. The first reason is, of course, transitional justice may not be equipped to do so. So the second reason is there's something a little bit undemocratic about it, the notion that you hand over this power to the judiciary or to experts. What do you think, Brian? Are you on this debate? Like, are you convinced by De Grief's arguments?
Not at all. So I feel so in sort of what transitional justice can aim to do is not, or what it should be is not ambitious at all. Because when we're looking at some of the ways of addressing horizontal inequalities, they were clearly divided between political, socio-economic, and cultural. And that if transitional justice is going to focus on just a political aspect to it, then the answer is very obvious. What is going to happen to the social and the cultural one when there are clear sort of guidelines that are laid down in how horizontal inequalities can be addressed from a social and economic and from a cultural perspective at all. So I don't think that it's ambitious at all for transitional justice to one to look at sort of past abuse of human rights, present, and then sort of what it can do looking at the future. Because seeking to, like I said before, for me it's all intricately linked. Seeking to solve political and economic horizontal inequalities cannot be looked at in isolation of socio-economic and cultural ones. Sorry, I would just say that the best example for that is again South Africa, when the Reconciliation Commission sought to look at political dimensions of their work, but then right now it is perhaps arguably the #1 most unequal country in the world economically. So that is as epically failing as it gets.
Okay, South Africa is a very good illustration of your point, and perhaps goes to show that there are limitations to your point in this, and well, it's my point, so I kind of agree with you. But South Africa, we would accept it as a democracy, albeit one that's very unusual in that you have one state in control all the time. There are functioning courts in a way. South Africa is something that is recognised as a democracy, and human rights are applicable there. There's constitutional protection and things like that. In terms of civil and political rights, South Africa is by no means perfect, but you do have a relatively vibrant democratic culture there. But as you say, it doesn't really translate into addressing economic injustice at all. It remains a very, very unjust society. What you have is a black middle class and upper class who has basically replaced certain elements of the white middle class and white upper class from apartheid, but the average person in places like Soweto is no better off than they were 30 years ago. If am I stating an argument? I'm not corrupting it, or?
Yeah, but shouldn't we say then that can be used as an hypothesis that for less than democratic societies where transitional justice is coming in to operate, that the main sole focus shouldn't be then on creating democratic societies. It should be complemented by something else. Because if you're focusing all our efforts on creating democratic societies, you're going to have 20 years from now, 10 years from now, multiple South Africas spread across the global south.
That is very much the risk that's at play. And again, you make a good point. Democracy as well and civil and political rights haven't stopped the United Kingdom or the United States or Ireland from becoming ever more unequal as well. And perhaps Degrieff is incorrect that a mere focus on democratic norms and standards and rights, particularly civil and political rights, in and of itself is not enough. There needs to be a broader focus. That certainly seems to be one of the strongest lessons, I suppose, that comes out of South Africa.
I don't believe that expanding the ambit or scope of transitional justice to look at more things is essentially a solution. Just to throw in a couple of points. One, it's not always a transition into democracy. It could be a transition of whatever other form of governance from a time of war to a time of peace. So it's not essentially looking at the same aspect. Secondly, once you focus on the civil and political rights, I think it's then also empowering the people, and you're putting in place a mechanism whereby people feel empowered to go for the governments, make provisions to address horizontal inequalities and such. I might be oversimplifying things here when I put it across this way, but human rights, international human rights law looks to address human rights in times of peace, humanitarian law during times of war, the minimum rights standards that need to be maintained. So again, when you look at transitional justice and say transitional justice is also supposed to do this, this and this, we're just creating a number of parallel systems of law without working within what is already existing. So I think saying that, we look at civil and political rights, we're able to attribute blame towards or liability towards some people, I think that's a good starting point for a society to work within the mechanism that already exists to give people the power and leverage to go forth from there.
Yeah, I agree with your point, I agree with Brian's point. I can't really reconcile them. I mean, you both make fundamentally reasonable points, as indeed does Aidan. And that's one of the things that's why I often feel the link between transitional justice and economics, it sometimes can be a little bit tenuous. We can accept intellectually that a concentration on democracy and human rights is isn't enough, that there needs to be attention to economic injustice. But the point you make is a useful one, that transitional justice can barely do the things that it is tasked with doing it at the moment. Is there really grounds for expanding it to look at other issues? It remains, I think, an open question. So that kind of brings us to, we're dealing with question 6 here as well. So let's dig into it a little bit deeper. Transitional justice attempts to create a society based on representative democracy and civil rights. Can we assume that the realisation of economic, social and cultural rights automatically flows from the enjoyment of civil and political rights? Ruth?
I don't think so. I think that it's pretty obvious that, like we've mentioned, the two are interlinked in a sense, but then I gave the example of the UK being a very democratic country, but that just, politics and democracy, I think, don't really go hand in hand. You don't just have democracy and that means that your politics all works out fine. I think that there needs to be a realisation that economic problems stem, like when you look into politics, the economic problems that stem from horizontal inequalities can't be solved through just deciding that you've got a strong democracy. I think that's just
Okay, but that's a good point. We talk about horizontal inequalities, that certain groups in society are identifiably richer and more prosperous than others, and that is one of the roots of conflict. Well, in a democracy, I think maybe the point you're getting is that sometimes those people who are already benefiting from the system have a vote too. Sometimes they will already be in the majority. That's something that's worth bearing in mind as well. Democracy may not be a silver bullet for the problems of economic inequality, because often the people who benefit the most will be in a majority or will have enough money and power to control democracy. So that's certainly one point that's worth bearing in mind. Sue, what do you think about this question?
I don't think that economic, social and cultural rights will automatically flow from civil and political rights, but then I think by addressing civil and political rights is actually like what our friends say, that it's like a starting point for the whole thing. So when we address civil and political rights, we are actually telling people that they have rights. So by doing that, it is actually giving them, it's like creating the awareness that they have the social and economic rights.
Okay, so that's sort of an argument for a sort of a thriving sort of civil, democratic political culture where issues can be discussed, people become aware of their rights and things like that. That's how we hope democracy and civil and political rights work. It doesn't always work like that, but again, that underlies a lot of the optimism that people like de Grief have, that the first step is creating a culture of respect and a culture of rights. Good things follow from that. Mohammed, do you have any opinion on, do you think that a respect for civil and political rights is the first step towards respect for economic rights? Hello?
I think so, because so far as the judicial activism is concerned, from the experience of Bangladesh, we saw that the apex judiciary of Bangladesh, in several cases, judicially enforced the socio-economic rights via the spirit of the CP rights, because the absolute enjoyment of CP rights is jurisprudentially impossible without the essence of ESC rights being implemented. So, being kind of creative in judicial activism, we saw that the apex courts or the judiciaries in particular cases in different jurisdictions, as in India also and in South Africa in different cases, in comparison, we saw that the courts of South Africa and India, in many cases, have implemented, though in those countries, ESC rights were not constitutionally guaranteed to be judicially enforceable, but those courts, those judiciaries showed that they can make it enforceable, because these are very essential for the enjoyment, the complete enjoyment of the CP rights.
Okay, yeah, well, one thing that's worth bearing in mind is India has always had its constitution suggests that socio-economic rights are justiciable, but there's been real problems in doing that. South Africa's constitution as well says that socio-economic rights are justiciable, that the courts can consider deprivations of socio-economic rights. But they've really struggled to do so, and it's something that most systems or human rights-based courts have struggled to deal with. We'll come back to that issue in a second. But I want to look at this question of the interaction between democracy and socio-economic rights a little bit more. Waldorf makes an argument that the reduction of long-standing inequality is something that is post-transitional. That is not something that transitional justice, as we understand it at the moment, can do. It is something that must be accomplished as part of creating a new and hopefully more democratic order. What do you make of this argument, Levin? Is it something that should be deferred? The whole question of economic justice. We've said it's difficult. We've said it's technically different for governments to accomplish. That it requires enormous systemic change. That it may be something that may require democratic deliberation by the people. Do you accept this argument that it's something that can be deferred? Or should be deferred?
You still have to be ambitious, because just to say something would be hard to achieve doesn't mean that you have to give up. I mean, nothing's going to be easy. Like, look at the trials and the truth commissions, like, they're not always guaranteed to be a success, but if they weren't there and they weren't trying to at least achieve something, then there would probably be no point in putting them in place anyway. You can say the same about trying to achieve social and economic rights. If you just give up and just say it's too hard, there's no point in implementing any systems, then...
Well, that's not quite what we're saying. We're saying it's too hard immediately, but that's something that can be addressed in future. I suppose the argument being that the longer you wait, the more stable your society is, the better your civil service becomes, the more your economy improves. I suppose that's the argument there. I don't think anyone's suggesting that you give up, but it is addressing the economic causes of violence something that should be deferred, or is it something you have to tackle immediately?
Well, I mean, I reckon that trials and truth commission probably had a bit more weight over at the start of time, just to get a balance in all of it. But yeah, you can say that to defer them for too long would create some social problems straight away from like the aftermath of war. So you'd have to at least put in place kind of some policies, not straight away, but it would have to be soon enough to have an impact on society.
Okay. Again, that's an argument I think that most people are making in the things we have looked at. But one of the things that's frustrating about this is that I couldn't give you any articles where someone was arguing transitional justice needs to address economic injustice by doing this. You know, most of but this. There's no articles I could find that outline a checklist of things that can be done. No one, as far as I'm aware, has come up with good recent arguments as to how truth commissions or trials can actively affect economic change. Most of the ways in which economists or development specialists argue that change can be promoted are by things like changing levels of taxation, ring-fencing the income that you get from mines or from taxes or from customs for certain social purposes. But even among the people that we look at here, like Arbour or like Miller, who argue very strongly that transitional justice needs to address issues of poverty and things like that, they don't really have much in the way of concrete solutions. So when you have someone like Waldorf coming along and saying, maybe this isn't something that transitional justice can do immediately, perhaps there's a kernel of sense in it, because even those who are most optimistic about a role for transitional justice in addressing poverty, they seem very unsure about how it might be done. Right.
Well, I think, so I would disagree with Waldorf and say that there are certain things when it comes to reducing inequality that can be aimed at immediately, and there are certain things that can be sort of for the long term. Because as we know, inequality and social and economic rights are, first of all, they're expensive, they require resources over a long period of time. That's the one thing about realization of socio-economic rights, is that for them to be realized, it's a progressive step. So, and progressive by its nature means long term. But there are certain measures that can be put in place, like you said, progressive taxation at the moment, which will ensure that the disparity in wealth between the rich and the poor is sort of lessened. And then there are also certain things such as capping the wealth of the rich so that to ensure that the rich don't amass even more wealth than they already have, and hence widening that disparity. So those are measures that can be put in place sort of as of now, or can be recommended by sort of commissions through a transitional justice that can be put in place. And there are also certain things like legislation that could be enacted, for example, which provide for positive discrimination, or which provide for whether it's sort of minority groups that are sort of quotas, whether it's in parliament or in schools. Those are immediate things that can be hoped for now. But then the other element of inequality when it comes to socio-economic rights, as the nature of being progressive, we can accept that there may be a bit long term.
Okay, but things like things like progressive taxation, for example, or quotas, arguably are things that a transitional justice mechanism like a Truth Commission can recommend, but of course they can't enforce. That still lies within the power of the government or the legislature. You talk about passing legislation to go and do it. Again, it's something that transitional justice can inform public debates about it, it can make recommendations, but again, it is something that lies slightly outside its sphere of competence. Perhaps in a way that issuing a report for a Truth Commission, or convicting someone through a criminal sentence like a Truth Commission, or awarding reparations, these are things that transitional justice bodies can do. They can directly do the things that they want to. It's often with socioeconomic rights, perhaps there's an intermediary step. There needs to be government intervention or civil service competence in a way that other goals of transitional justice mechanisms, that hasn't necessarily been the case. Jess?
I'd argue that, I don't think it's possible for truth, at least TRCs, and maybe even transitional justice as a whole, to actually be able to address economic issues to create a checklist of saying these things you need to address in order to stop economic inequalities or whatever. Solely because transitional justice, at least as it is being seen currently, is always recommendatory in itself. It's never. There's been I don't think there's been any ones where they've had real legal powers, like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions anyway. They don't have any kind of major legal powers to change the way that things are.
No, they don't. I mean, they're not. It's not a legislature, right? Most of what it can do is recommendatory. But go on.
So, I'd argue that in order to actually, there are a lot of things that can, like as Brian said, there are a lot of things like legislation, changes in taxation, changes in a lot of different things that you can use to solve economic issues. But the problem is that it is the government's duty to do that, and if they don't want to listen to what you're going to say, they're not going to do it. So I don't think it's viable to actually say to any kind of transitional justice or TRC body that you have to solve these sort of things, because they can't. They have no power to solve these things. Everything is recommendatory. And, if you look at South Africa, for example, I mean, maybe you could argue that it wasn't like this under Mandela, but we've kind of just fought one government for, one exploitative government for another. And if you're going to have one government who wants to line their pockets, and they're replaced by another government who wants to line their pockets, they're not going to change anything because it's all going to benefit them. So there's no point in saying, oh, let's change all of these sort of things, because if the government that's in power, which I kind of argue is a lot of post-conflict situations, if the government in power isn't, if they're benefiting from the system, why on earth would they change it?
That's something we looked at when we were talking about Truth Commissions, that sometimes government feel free to ignore their recommendations. Governments, after conflict or authoritarianism, usually have democratic legitimacy. Truth Commissions, at best, often have moral legitimacy. And sometimes, the government, because they have so much power, they do feel free to ignore recommendations that come from other bodies.
I'm leaning to agree with Waldorf's statement that the reduction of long-standing inequality is necessarily post-transitional. Like Jess said, it's all recommendatory in nature, so nothing may be taken into account. And also I believe that it adds an additional burden on transitional justice as it is today to say that we're going to keep expanding the scope of it to include everything, while not effectively being able to actually deliver anything because everything is recommendatory. At least starting off with trials and holding, attributing liability and accountability is a start at some level. But like saying everything needs to be done through transitional justice becomes absolutely unreasonable. And two, the entire point of transitional justice or the society transitioning is so that your government and the society as a whole can start to function effectively by itself. So these are issues to be dealt with by post-conflict societies, and transitional justice should act as an enabler to help them move towards this kind of a society, as opposed to trying to fix all of their problems. And thirdly, talking of, it's not like international arbitration where you can say competence, and transitional justice mechanisms get to decide their own jurisdiction. They don't. They have to work within a given ambit and given resources and given mechanisms. So I think it's absolutely unrealistic to say that transitional justice needs to be able to tackle all of these problems, while you're saying a post-conflict society is completely resolved of all of these problems because of transition.
Yeah, you make a good point. Things like punishment and truth and reparations, they lie entirely within the powers of the bodies that are established to do them. For anything else, for a broader impact on society, they require the cooperation of the government, of a civil service, which is or is not there. Yeah, that's one of the problems I think that tends to be underplayed in a lot of the debates that argue for good reasons that socioeconomic rights are important, but that sort of organisational link may not necessarily exist. Kaya?
No, I just wanted to agree with that. I think that like extending the responsibilities of transition justice is unnecessary and it's not possible, and it kind of makes no sense because we are transitional justice considered the time of within the state that the state is not strong enough. So first, let's solve the criminal aspects, political aspects, so let's say transition to democracy or to whatever system. And then, when the country grows stronger, let's consider economic, civil, and cultural rights, when actually the stronger state, the stronger it grows, the better it can deal with these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come back to you in a second. That sounds perfectly reasonable. But one of the things we learned, we were looking at the historical evolution of transitional justice as a concept, is that people began to realise that justice, criminal justice and truth have limitations, even when they're used in combination with each other. So like what you're saying is perfectly sensible and perfectly reasonable. Societies still remain very imperfect. The people, when you poll them and survey them, remain very unhappy, even with things like criminal justice, even with stability, even with democracy, because people want their societies to function as well as they possibly can. And while I don't doubt for a second that you're right, scholars in lots of the articles we've read have been unhappy with that, and people on the ground often seem dissatisfied with it as well. From the distance of us talking about it here in Liverpool, we may be able to say that's as much as transitional justice can achieve. If you're on the ground, or if you're a particularly critical type of academic, you may expect more, and that's why we're having the discussions we are. But I take your point, absolutely.
Yes, and in an ideal world, the transitional justice would just within let's say a few years, every single problem is solved, but it's not the case in practice. So
yeah, that's very true.
I struggle to say that maybe it's not possible to adequately reduce long-standing inequality within the sort of current global framework that we have. Transitional justice has to operate within a certain global framework.
I knew you were going to say that. I knew you were going to say that. You said
and all the things that are spoken about, all the solutions to socio-economic inequalities, I think Brown mentions.
Yeah.
Things like progressive taxes, bank regulation, state land redistribution, state subsidies, they're all solutions within a certain global capitalist framework, and transitional justice necessarily has to operate within sort under that framework. So I think it's kind of, it's naive to think that we can just alter certain socio-economic problems
within a single state.
Within a single framework like that. It's much easier, well, it's much more efficient and beneficial to alter certain political structures within certain states to try and enable people to then alter socio-economic standard within.
I was going to ask that question on the sheet, but I knew you'd bring it up, so I didn't bother. But you make a very reasonable point, that you can have all the changes that you want within a domestic society. You can have a fully empowered democracy. You can have a government that is committed to redistribution or taxation or welfare. But lots of governments in the developing world, where most conflict happens, exist in a matrix of global relations where they often don't have the freedom to do that. They don't have the freedom to put money into hospitals or into welfare because they owe money to the IMF or to international debtors. They don't have the ability to raise money, to pump money, to revive their own economies or to make their own factories function because they are trapped into a matrix of rules that dictates how trade should happen with the rest of the world. And one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that all states, and every state can improve, every state can organise its economy better, every state can have greater respect for socio-economic rights. But some of them operate with shackles on them, and they can't do everything that they want to because they are bound by international debts that they owed, they are bound by fundamentally unequal trading relations with the developed world as well. So again, you raise a very valuable point that not everything here comes down to the decisions that a truth commission or a trial in a given state. It doesn't all come down to their operations. It doesn't come down to how seriously a government decides to take recommendations from a truth commission or to pursue criminal accountability for certain economic forms of injustice. It often comes down to the fact that the world is a very unequal place and that in the modern world, developing economies have very, very little freedom to fundamentally re-alter their own socio-economic structures. They can do some things, absolutely, but they can't do everything. I saw some hands up on this one. Brian, did you?
And criminal prosecutions and trials also part of transitional justice? Mm-hmm. They are, and if they are, what is recommendatory nature about that? If you look at conflicts that have been fueled by, for example, access to resources or precious minerals, for example, in Sierra Leone with diamonds, and then you get the Special Court for Sierra Leone coming in and indicting some of the heavy players in that civil war, and in essence breaking a large chain of the sort of economic dimensions of Sierra Leone at the time. For me, there's really nothing recommendatory about that, because what the Special Court has done is that it has broken a large piece of what was fueling the civil war as it's intricately linked to the diamonds. And needless to say, diamonds are also intricately linked to inequality and economic prosperity of certain groups. So even just the act of transitional justice where it comes to a special court that is indicting heavy players in a civil war that are in and of themselves responsible for controlling resources that are tilting the balance of inequality, then that is a very good, it's an immediate step that is happening through the transitional process, and it's going to be fundamental in addressing inequality in that particular region.
Yeah, you're right, but I suppose when we're talking about recommendatory approaches, typically that's all truth commissions can do. Trials, as you say, can punish actual wrongdoing there and then. What's interesting about the Special Court for Sierra Leone is that it typically tried crimes against humanity and war crimes. It didn't really deal with economic crimes as economic crimes. It didn't criminally punish anyone for corruption, for example, which was arguably at the root of the conflict in Sierra Leone, or didn't criminally prosecute people for kleptocracy, the theft of the natural resources of the state. So even criminal punishment in Sierra Leone was oriented, more towards bodily integrity abuses than it was towards economic crimes, if you know what I'm saying.
But the fact that there was criminal prosecutions meant that there was sort of addressing some of the, because the reason why there was even crimes against humanity and war crimes happening is because of damage.
Yeah.
It's just that's the bottom line. And that punishing or indicting those people responsible is sort of indirectly also going to address the cause of that war, because they were the key players in that civil war.
Oh, possibly it is, but what if you look at the crimes in Sierra Leone and you say the message that comes out of the crimes is you shouldn't torture, you shouldn't kill, you you shouldn't rape, and all of which are valuable lessons, but possibly the more important lessons for Sierra Leone is you shouldn't export diamonds without having them taxed by the government. You shouldn't run your own private, people within the state shouldn't be able to run their own diamond mines. People shouldn't use revenue from diamond mines to engage in corruption. You know what I'm saying? The focus in the Special Court for Sierra Leone was still very much on bodily integrity crimes as bodily integrity crimes. It wasn't really engaging with the economics of those crimes, if you know what I'm saying. It wasn't saying, it was more concerned with war crimes and crimes against humanity than it was with kleptocracy and stealing and corruption, which arguably were the roots of the war. Civil and political rights abuses, war crimes and crimes against humanity were symptoms of the war, but the actual roots of the war lay in corruption and theft, which weren't really prosecuted by the
So do you not feel like implicating the indictees had any effect whatsoever on the economic dimensions in Sierra Leone?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think what was more valuable was the Truth Commission recommendations about how the diamond trade should operate. But I'm not convinced that the judgments passed by the Special Court for Sierra Leone said anything useful at all about the economic roots of the conflict. I mean, it said the war was effectively fought for control over diamonds, which was fine, but they weren't the crimes that were being punished. The crimes that were being punished weren't fundamentally economic crimes. They were the same crimes that people were being punished for in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, if you know what I'm saying. There was no attempt to prosecute corruption and kleptocracy. They were the real roots of poverty in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone could be, in theory, quite a rich place if you were able to use the diamond resources that were there. Those resources were being used for something else. And you can make an argument that a criminal process that focuses more on the symptoms of the war, like crimes against humanity and war crimes, fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict, which was more about the fact that diamonds were used as forms of corruption or patrimonial rule. Is what I'm saying making sense? Yeah, but you're unconvinced, which is fine.
Yeah, I'm happily unconvinced, but that's probably a discussion for another time.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Well, by no means should you ever feel the need to be convinced by what I'm saying. I do not mind if you disagree with me at all. David, there is... Where was I going to... Sorry, where was I? Okay, let's move on to question 9. Miller argues that leaving economic development, issues of resource distribution or inequality of power wealth to separate courts or to executive control, transitional justice institutions implicitly tell society that the development of conflict may be separated in a fair fashion, that inequality itself is not to be prosecuted or amnesty. Arbor makes a similar point. The prevailing understandings of justice that we have tend to assume that civil and political rights or freedoms in relation to which violations can be found, while economic, social and cultural rights are entitlements which depend on available resources. Do you agree with this sort of argument that there is a suggestion that civil and political rights can be punished, or their deprivations can be, or that they can be enforced in the courts, but socio-economic rights are something more cloudy, more amorphous, that aren't really enforceable in the same way?
Yeah, I get what they're saying, especially sort of economic, social and cultural rights and entitlements. That means they're more dependent on sort of resource. I guess it just goes back to what I was kind of saying earlier, but I kind of feel that, you know, judicial bodies, their responsibility is to look at violations of past wrongs and identify the truth about it, but I feel that the issues concerning development are a question of policy and debate, so it's not really thought about.
Okay, yeah, this is one of the sort of fundamental debates people always have about rights. It's why historically almost every state in history has found ways to successfully enforce civil and political rights, because you can identify very clear wrongdoing, you can identify a very clear remedy, at least in theory. Whereas, you know, the primary remedy for torture, for example, is to not torture anymore, followed by criminal punishment. The primary remedy for deprivation of voting rights, for example, is to simply pass legislation that enables people to vote. The primary remedy for an enforced disappearance or for kidnapping, for example, is to locate the body and to punish people who've gone and done it. Civil and political rights, at least the way the argument goes, have a much more identifiable and clear path towards a remedy, where socioeconomic rights arguably do not. If you identify a failure to provide sufficient education or a failure to provide sufficient welfare, if you identify the fact that one group in society has an awful lot of resources and another group in society do not, the remedies to those problems are multifaceted and require an awful lot of control over resources. So if you're going to redress education or welfare, you basically need to take revenue from people who have money, including the state, and pump it into these areas. If you are to redress inequalities in terms of finances, you need to be able to requisition resources from certain groups in society, or you need to be able to tax them quite highly. That can set in chain its own forms of opposition. So the argument goes that it's much harder to enforce socioeconomic rights than it is to enforce civil and political rights. And that isn't something I don't think that the authors in these particular cases have really addressed. What do you think, Cal? Are socioeconomic rights ever enforceable in the same way that civil and political rights?
Denial of them.
Go on?
Denial of economic rights are enforceable. Or, the economy still needs to be created in a post-conflict zone. There's basically nothing there anyway, so it depends on see, some of these, the reading, it's pretty much the transitional justice scholars are leaning towards social justice warriors, which means that they come up with all kinds of aspirational things, which are not even relevant to the economy, and something that Eva said earlier. It's about building the structure, it's aspirational. The most important thing is food to mouth, and that's one of the important things. So if it's all about the economy and how these things are distributed, then basically 50% of nothing is still nothing. But when it comes to the courts, if we're talking about the rights enforceable, well, rights against what?
Well, arguably, if there's a constitutional right, for example, to an education, and the government fails to secure it, I mean that.
The state's broken. I mean, we're talking about something that you want to aim for. It's not something that's actually in place.
Okay, Ruth.
I think that the judicial action in the sense of social and economic rights, I think you possibly could enforce them in the same way, but I'm not sure it's the right way to go about it. I think that maybe if you are, what does that actually do? Like David was saying before, it's a case of you need to enforce those rights in a different way, because judicial bodies are made to look into something that's happened. It's really obvious to think, whereas solving an issue, there needs to be action, there needs to be things that's done. You need to take money from different areas and put them in different areas, and I don't think judicial action is actually a positive way to try and enforce socio-economic rights.
Yeah, again, you're getting back to that causal problem of judicial institutions are good at diagnosing problems, but they're not necessarily good at diagnosing solutions, or even if they are, they're always a step or two away from the levers of effective power to operate a civil service, to raise taxation, to divert resources towards a certain body. And that possibly goes back to one of the core divisions between civil and political rights and socio-economic rights. One that sadly none of these pieces of writing are really dealing with sufficiently. And again, I look for pieces that did, but they're not really there. There does seem to be a slight element of cheerleading. Perhaps things that Cal says that are overly aspirational in relation to socio-economic justice. It's very easy to make a moral case that socio-economic justice is important and transitional justice should address it, but we see very little in the way of practical, pragmatic, causational language that suggests how it can be done. Maria, let's go to question 10. Miller notes that the literature on transitional justice and the institutions of transitional justice have largely ignored, that's clearly a typo, socioeconomic justice. Do you think this is because scholars in the field care only for civil and political rights, because transitional justice is essentially a liberal centre-right field of activity, or because transitional justice is too weak? So one of the arguments that Miller is making, I suppose, in the article is that one of the reasons why transitional justice has ignored socioeconomic rights is that most people who believe in in transitional justice and in rights are sort of liberal, more interested in civil and political rights than socioeconomic ones. Do you think that there's sort of a bias or blindness at play on the part of people like me and Alex, and perhaps you, Lash?
No, I think that the reason that transitional justice is very focused on civil and political rights is because it's been created by, well, it's been like, yeah, created, not created, but based on international human rights law and also criminal justice. And so, in a sense, international human rights started by developing civil and political rights protection. However, it's been developing in order to protect economic, social, and cultural rights, understanding them like as indivisible. So they are like in the same. They should be for me in the same category: civil and political rights with economic, social, and civil rights. And I wouldn't say that accountability is the only way to face a problem. And that this is one of the problems with transitional justice that is very based in criminal law. So I would say that transitional justice is very based in civil and political rights, and because some of the scholars that support it think that this is the starting point, like Viva was saying, but I don't think it is. I think it should be a whole package, like protecting civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, because all of them are the same. I believe that if you are willing to have a democratic government, you have to protect all of these rights, not only civil and political rights. I also believe that they are enforceable and the justice should be made for economic, social, and cultural rights. I think that you can actually find violations of it, and I think that the problem with the enforcement is a fear in the state to actually face the responsibility that it means for it to have to use resources from different parties to actually focus on health, education, health, and so on. So.
Okay, so you're less convinced than some of the other people here that there's that fundamental difference between civil and political rights.
Yeah.
They're both, not only are both essential, they're also enforceable. And if I understand you correctly, part of the reason isn't so much scholars are obsessed with civil and political rights, but the governments are afraid to take on these sorts of responsibilities.
Exactly, and I was discussing this with one friend from Mexico as well during the weekend, and we were saying...
Just ring it up, talking about my class.
No, because he was doing a master in human rights as well in Mexico, but it's so different. So we were saying that you guys in this part of the world are very concerned about civil and political rights and liberties, whereas in Latin America, at least, we are really worried about guaranteeing like economic, social, and cultural rights because of the difference that the society has, the minority groups, and the different like kind of population. So that is the reason we really believe that they are enforceable and that the courts can actually look at it. And actually, for example, like in the Mexican Constitution, we have different kind of mechanisms to make it happen for the communities to have economic, social, and cultural rights. You can ask the government to do it, and they have to do it because they are bound by the Inter-American Court. So
human rights. Yeah,
yeah.
that's a good point.
One
other point that's worth bearing in mind is that the government in China takes, for example, there are some governments, but China is a good example of government that says that socioeconomic rights are of such fundamental importance they come before civil and political rights. Or I don't know if that's your understanding of it, but in China, the Chinese government has suggested for a long time that socioeconomic rights are far more important than civil and political rights. And again, you see a growing economy, many millions of people being lifted out of poverty. I don't know if any of you have. Do you have any opinion on that argument? But it is something that's worth bearing in mind. One of the single greatest increase in terms of socioeconomic rights in the last 20 or 30 years has been in China, a government which has prioritised socioeconomic rights over civil and political rights. That's an decent argument. Jessica?
I agree partially with Fernanda for the fact that, like, I think it is. Like Western societies in general do tend to, or at least like our sort of societies tend to focus a lot more on the political and civil sort of aspect and things because that's the way everything in our country is based. It's there's a lot there's a lot of focus on democracies and our parliaments and our courts and all this sort of thing. Whereas, and I think that's partially due to the fact that, you know, yes, okay, there is economic disparities between people. I'm not going to say that, you know, there's no one in the UK not living in poverty. Of course there are, but in terms of like the percentage of people, it's far less than, say, somewhere like South Africa, where a large majority of people are living in abject poverty. And so, like, I think when you're in but the problem comes when you have like instances of transitional justice. It's usually it's usually other countries coming in and sort of like helping to shape those sort of transitional justice mechanisms, and sort of, or like the international sphere, like helping to shape these sort of transitional justice mechanisms. And so I think there is a shift of focus towards a political and civil like mandates and that sort of thing, because, you know, I think there is a belief within the international sphere that if you address those issues, that everything will else will fall in line, whereas it doesn't actually happen. I think transitional justice is just I agree with the last point on this, where transitional justice is too weak to actually be able to deal with long-term systematic inequalities that have plagued countries for generations. And I don't think it is possible to address those issues in 2-3 years, which is the general time limit for these.
Well, I don't think anyone's suggesting that they would address them in and of themselves. The idea, I suppose, is that you make recommendations that can set this in train. Perhaps next week, when you look at reparations, people have some very ambitious schemes for that possibly may achieve a lot, within the space of 3 years. There's no suggestion, I don't think, that anyone thinks transitional justice can fundamentally alter society within 3 years. But I suppose the argument is that it can ground certain ways of thinking or certain priorities, or make some recommendations that can make a fairly sizable impact.
Okay,
go on.
I think the problem is even if you do make recommendations of how to sort out a society's economic state, where's the society meant to get the money from? Where's the society meant to actually get these funds to sort these sort of things out? I don't see, as you said earlier, and Brian stated earlier, countries who come out of conflict are generally bound to rules and regulations laid down by countries that have given them money to get them out of debt. So if they're further and further in debt, with these other countries, and they're bound by these sort of like, you have to spend money on these certain things, and it's just illogical.
You're absolutely right, but every government has at least some elements of discretionary expenditure, even if it's a matter of spending money on schools rather than on armaments, or if it's a matter of devolving control of natural resources to marginalised communities on whose land they are found. You can't do everything, but there are sensible policies that every government can do to address some forms of inequality within their society, even if they can't do everything. And even if we accept Aidan's point that they've always got one or perhaps two hands tied behind their back to begin with, by virtue of things like their indebtedness and things like that. Again, I don't think people are being overly utopian in suggesting that transitional justice can fundamentally alter societies. The argument is more that if we're really serious about getting to grips with the meaning of injustice, there needs to be some sort of form of examination of the roots of it. Quite a few people have mentioned the practicalities of transitional justice, and you did there, Jess. Let's move on to question 11. What weaknesses do Truth Commission suffer from in terms of addressing socioeconomic inequalities? Helen, any ideas? Anyone? Kaya?
The Truth Commission, they don't have a mandate to address economic, for example, economic crimes. Scholars said that there is it underlines the call for actually giving Truth Commission to underline economic crimes such as corruption, like in the moment of the conflict. But I like the quote from Mulder, I think. It is unrealistic to expect them, for the Truth Commission, to offer informed strategic recommendations on everything from toiletry for education, they simply lack the expertise for such policy formulation. And I agree with that one. They just can't deal with everything, every single aspect of transition.
Okay, yeah, that is one of the fundamental weaknesses, perhaps, of truth commissions. That it's very, very difficult to expect a group of people, be they 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, to comprehensively address these forms of injustice. They may not have that great degree of expertise. Again, as we said, we were talking about truth commissions. Truth commissioners are often selected on the basis of their moral strength or their record or even their identity. They are rarely selected on the basis of where exactly their range of professional expertise is found. So they may not be economists, they may not be civil servants. So in one way it makes it very hard for them to make firm recommendations about the use of taxation or how to set up services. Now we shouldn't exaggerate those problems. If where there is a will, there is a way. If the international community could certainly fund forms of assistance to go and help commissioners and go and make this, or you could reorient your selection policies for commissioners to put an emphasis on people with this degree of expertise. So the point you make is a valid one. Again, Waldorf makes the point very well in his article. But that's not an impossible barrier, some would argue. You can possibly appoint people with those degrees of expertise. And remember, political parties make recommendations like this all the time, but they don't necessarily have the background that's there. But that certainly is one of the more formidable barriers between having a truth commission and actually making practical recommendations. Any other?
He continues though that there are even it goes even to this point that the truth commissions are simply weak, and it underlines that it's short. They have short lifespans, and which I also agree with. It's only a moment of time that they are dealing with their current problems. They are not like for 10 years or 20 years to deal with the actual problems.
No, you're right. I mean, they're not sort of permanent governing institutions. They're established for a very short period of time. But, it's still not impossible for them to go back and assess some of the economic roots of a conflict, like diamonds in Sierra Leone, for example, or control of agricultural land in Guatemala. You can make fairly broad-based recommendations about where a problem lies, and you can say this is something that the government needs to address. It may not be the case that a Truth Commission needs to make very firm recommendations itself. It could make very broad and general ones. But you're right in that they are very short-term institutions with limited scope and with limited resources. Any other reasons why Truth Commissions are weak? Or indeed any reasons why they are particularly strong? No, just, again, there's quite a few reasons within the literature that are there, but again, the sort of the practical reasons that Kaya is suggesting are among the more salient. And again, I go back to this point that it is significant that very few people there are making a practical argument for how trials, truth commissions and reparations can actively address the economic roots of conflict. It's very easy to say that justice to be meaningful must address those economic rights. It's a lot more difficult to spell out practical, pragmatic steps to go and do so. Go on.
I was going to say that truth commissions could have a possibility to actually help economic, social and cultural rights, but the only problem is that the recommendations are not binding for the government. However, they could establish the idea of signing treaties in international protection of economic, social and cultural rights, also establish a training for the judges to make them understand that economic, social and cultural rights are actually enforceable, and they can also suggest that economic, social and cultural rights should be considered within the Constitution, so they would be binding for the state, and also they would be establishing responsibilities for the state to protect them. But, I mean, the problem here is that the recommendations are not binding for the government.
Yeah, quite right. I mean, that is the one really big problem with Truth Commission recommendations, that they're not binding. No government would ever agree to establish a Truth Commission if it believed it could be bound absolutely by their recommendations. For one thing, it's kind of undemocratic, but for another thing, the Truth Commission might make recommendations that are either impossible for them or politically unpopular. So they're never binding. But, again, you point out some reasonable things, that a Truth Commission, if it makes recommendations, can emphasise that certain things are important, most notably socio-economic rights. It can diagnose the economic root causes of conflict, and it can say that it's important to address these. It can say that it's important to be a party to international treaties. It's important to constitutionalise these sorts of rights. So it can't do everything, but it can, maybe in the way that the Grief was suggesting earlier, it can embed constitutional principles or the idea of rights within a discussion in a state where it hasn't been part of the discussion before. Right.
But also as a weakness of truth commissions, in that because their mandate is often limited to perpetrators or persons who actually committed acts against humanities, that lends well, or that sort of helps in helping towards criminal justice. But often truth commissions do not focus on the beneficiaries of, for example, if it's an apartheid regime, and that if they were to focus on some of the beneficiaries as well of that apartheid regime, it might mean that some form of social justice and hence economic inequality is reduced. But their mandate is often specifically focused in a tunnel vision of the perpetrators, but not beneficiaries.
Yeah, I think you're right. Now, one thing I will say is that the South African Truth Commission is from the mid-90s. I think that the South African Truth Commission was established now, there'd be such international pressure or pressure from NGOs to look at economic issues that there would probably be a different focus now, and maybe there'd be a greater concentration on economic injustice and on beneficiaries. So, I mean, most truth commissions that have been established since, in the likes of East Timor or even Sierra Leone or Peru, have engaged a little bit more with economic injustice and crimes. Now, it didn't necessarily translate into much in the way of action, but you're right in that usually truth commissions seem to be more oriented towards civil and political rights. But I think things are slightly different now. 20 years on, there's a greater openness to looking at economic crimes. It doesn't necessarily translate into recommendations that are enforced, or it doesn't necessarily translate into legal measures against beneficiaries. But I do think there's a slightly greater commitment now to issues of economic injustice than there was. If any truth commission was established now and it completely ignored economic injustice or economic roots of conflict, condemnation from the international human rights community in particular would be quite loud. So things have changed a little bit, but I mean, your fundamental point still remains that civil and political rights still form a much bigger part of the remit of truth commission. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think we can take that point and go even further. So you'll want to observe the perpetrators or the beneficiaries of the sort of, the violence that occurred. The economic beneficiaries, we can look outside of just say the state that is under the Truth Commission. El Salvador's in the next question. We can look at what role did American investment in Central America have on the violence in El Salvador.
Absolutely. And one of the big criticisms that was made of the truth commissions in Central America was the fact that the role of the US government in propping up the regimes and the role of American capitalism in continuing to trade in very preferential terms with these regimes were probably the reason why they existed in the first place. No one ever looked at the international communities that bought diamonds from South Africa, and no one ever looked at the way the Australians and Indonesians started divided up the island of Timor Gap in East Timor. And I absolutely agree with I think everyone would accept that the truth commissions tend to ignore the broader global or geopolitical conditions that underpin conflict. And again, we talk about the economic roots of conflict lying in horizontal inequalities, but if you take a step back further, there's an awful lot. The international community and global patterns of inequality have an awful lot to do with inequalities within states as well. Colonialism and the whole process of divide and conquer was arguably the first step in it, but now things like the WTO and the IMF impose conditions that tend to exacerbate divisions where they exist, make them very hard to repair if you go and try and do them. I accept the point, absolutely. I know that some of you have got international criminal law in a second, so we've only got 12 minutes, so we'll just park it here. The last three questions are less general ones. They certainly don't deal very much with what's coming up in the formative assessment, but hopefully this lecture will have prepared you for that. I also guarantee there'll be a question on economic injustice or reparations, which you're looking at next week. They they'll be one of the coursework options that you have later in the year. I'm just curious about, is this class, just going forward next year, is this a class that's worth happening? Because, as I was saying, literature is very frustrating in the sense that you've lots of people saying that socioeconomic justice is important, but very few people arguing how you go and do it. Is there? Should I rejig this seminar next year, or does it?
More critical. I think the only one that I found, I think it was pretty much junk. Apart from Waldorf.
Apart from Waldorf.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Waldorf is the person I found most. I have to say, Waldorf is the person I found most convincing. But is there sort of a problem? I mean, economic justice is very important, so we can't really ignore it in the course of doing these lectures. But an awful lot of the literature on it is very frustrating in the sense that there isn't an awful lot of detail in how transitional justice can go about doing these things. If anyone's got any thoughts, email them to me. I've done this particular lecture now for 2 or 3 years. 1 year it worked really well, 1 year it worked very badly, this year it's gone okay. But sometimes it's a very, I know more than okay, but sometimes it's a quite a frustrating discussion because there's very little to get your teeth into. There's a strong moral case, but there's no practical case being made. And that's what Waldorf, I think, is getting at in his article, that these things are easy to say, but you need to spell out a causal pathway towards it. Really enjoyed this. Thanks very much for your contributions. Get in touch if you have any questions about the formative. If you're interested in doing a dissertation on this or any other transitional justice related issues, come and talk to me after a class or send me an email. I'm happy to discuss it with you. And I'll see you all